Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Alliance for Journalist Freedom's launch of our Press Freedom Tracker. If we've not yet met, my name is Olivia Peary-Griffiths. I'm the Executive Director of the AJF. I will just take a moment before I kick things off to acknowledge that I'm broadcasting this to you today from Gadigal land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Now, I know I speak for the AJF board when I say that we're delighted to be launching this project with you today. In particular, we're excited to have so many of our both regional partners and colleagues here. We've got people joining us from Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar, Singapore, Hong Kong, Fiji, Hawaii, India, even Vienna. And it's of course wonderful to have all of our Australian colleagues with us as well. So before I hand over to Peter, I will just take you through a very brief overview of the event today. So Peter will give you an overview and talk through the actual purpose of the Press Freedom Tracker project. I'll then walk you through the platform itself. And then Peter will introduce the wonderful Natasha Kassam from the Lowy Institute, and the two of them will discuss the implications of the project and its data. After that, there'll be time for a Q&A. So you should see at the bottom of your Zoom window that there should be a little Q&A icon. So please put your questions in there towards the end of the event. Peter and Tash will let you know when it's time to do that. And aside from that, that's all you need to know. I assume that given you found yourself to an AJF event, you probably know who Peter Grester is. But Peter is the spokesperson and director of the Alliance for Journalist Freedom. He founded it alongside Chris Flynn and Peter Wilkinson after he spent 400 days in prison in Egypt. Now, Peter is also the UNESCO Chair of Journalism and Communication at the University of Queensland, and of course, an award-winning journalist. So enough from me. Peter, if you'd like to unmute, and yeah, you can take it away.
Great. Thank you very much for that introduction, Olivia. It's incredibly exciting to be able to snip the virtual ribbon on our Press Freedom Tracker today. This is something that we've been keen to put together for a while. What we wanted to do was really create a data set that was neutral. It wasn't making judgments, that wasn't trying to rank countries in order of press freedom credentials. What we wanted to do was to create a piece of information that would inform advocacy and public and civic debate. It would help diplomacy and help us understand and monitor what's going on in press freedom across the region, both positive and negative. It's something we've been keen to do, as I said, for a while, but it turns out that the data is far bigger and much more complex than we first imagined. Superficially, of course, you'd think that press freedom is relatively straightforward to monitor. Newsrooms raided, journalists in prison, editors threatened, that kind of thing. But the deeper we looked, the more we discovered the subtle ways that press freedom is eroded. Sometimes it's through grinding bureaucracy and regulation that saps a news organisation's ability to remain viable. Sometimes it's online harassment through trolls, doxing and so on. Sometimes it's in the guise of laws that are designed to boost national security or control fake news in the name of COVID. Of course, those laws can also criminalise legitimate reporting. What counts as a restriction on press freedom is hard to pin down and harder to measure and plot on a graph, and it's taken a huge amount of work to unpack those issues and work out clear parameters. And I really want to take a moment to give a shout out to Bronte Wild, our volunteer who put together all this data with fantastic help from Gary Dixon, a tutor in journalism and law and ethics at Monash University. Bronte painstakingly scoured the internet for data and helped organise it all. She's put a lot of time into this project and it wouldn't exist without her. So thank you. And thank you also to Gary for helping us establish the framework for how we should capture that data and why. This really was an absolutely critical step. But it also wouldn't have happened, of course, without money. And for that, I need to thank the Facebook Journalism Project. Now, the funds they gave us allowed us to hire Bronte as our researcher 2 days a week to keep updating the numbers and developing the tracker. And it also wouldn't have happened without the wonderful technology that you're about to see. For that, I need to say another huge thanks to Click Software. That's Click with a Q, Q-L-I-K software, for generously providing their platform and their services pro bono. We also need to thank Decision Inc., the company that's hosting our server, and they're doing that on a cost-neutral basis. And finally, a big thank you to Media Super, who are our event partners for 2021. So let me hand back the screen to Olivia, who'll walk us through the tracker. And as you'll see, it's the kind of thing where the more time you spend, the deeper you dive, the more stories the data starts to reveal. Olivia, it's all yours.
Thanks, PG, and hi folks, it's me again. Just bear with me while I share this screen. All right, so you should find yourself on the AJF webpage where the Press Freedom Tracker is housed. As you can see, there is some text there that Peter has already gone through when he described the overview and purpose of the project, so we won't touch on that. But you'll see that there's a little bouncing arrow down the bottom that takes you down to the platform itself. So what I'm going to do is walk you through all the elements of the actual platform, and then I'll show you how to actually use them. So at the top, you can see there's the map itself. To the left of that is a description. To the right are some navigation tools. Below that are 3 pie graphs, one for something called series, the other for types of incidents, and the other on the far right for incident targets. Below that, you can see a timeline of the incidents and then a tab next to that heading to incident descriptions. And then below that, you can see a PFT definitions key. Now, this is really worth going and having a look at, especially with respect to the incident types and target types, because you'll see how we've classified the data. Below that, you'll see other useful definitions. And one I'd suggest you look at is the note on laws. It shows you why we've included some laws that are actually outside our tracking time frame of 2018 to present, but it shows you why that's the case. All right, let's get stuck in. So as you can see up the top, we are tracking press freedom incidents in the Asia Pacific from 2018 to present. When you view the map, you can see all the icons on the countries that we've to date had the capacity to track. So this map will change. As Peter just mentioned, we've been able, thanks to Facebook Journalism Project, to hire Bronte 2 days a week. So we will now start tracking Taiwan, Papua New Guinea, and moving further into the Pacific, which we're looking forward to doing for our Pacific partners, especially those joining us today. So when you when you hover your mouse over one of the icons, it should show you a snapshot of the incidents and laws that have occurred in the time period that we're tracking. You're also able to click in to those countries or territories and the map will zoom in. Just note that when you do that, all the corresponding data below will change as a result. And then you can click back or return home to find yourself back in the regional overview. On the far right, you can see that there are navigation tools. They're pretty straightforward. But if you do, you can also click and drag on the map itself. And if you find yourself in the ocean, a place where you don't really want to be, just click back on the little home icon and it will recenter the map for you. Now, if we come over to the description on the left, you can see up the top that aside from the period that we're tracking, we're also taking a closer look at 2 specific series, COVID-19 and the Myanmar crisis. Now, what we mean by series are events that have occurred in the time period that we're tracking that have resulted in a significant uptick or upswing of press freedom incidents that are directly related to that event. So for example, if you click onto COVID-19, the map will zoom into the various countries that have had and have seen events. Oh, beg your pardon, that's taking a hot minute. Just give it a second. That have seen, I'll do it again, that have seen events occur as a direct result of the COVID-19 pandemic. There you go. And then all of the data below, as I mentioned, changes accordingly. You can see as we look at the timeline there, there's been a real uptick since COVID-19, which is fairly alarming. So that's a particular look at that series. If we go back, and the same goes for the Myanmar crisis if you zoom in on that. All right, it's also important to note, this is the last point in the description on the far left, it's important to note that an absence of data in the countries and territories that we're looking at doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't incidents in that location. It may just mean that there's a lack of transparency in that country. Basically, we weren't able to access any data. Brunei is an example here that I'm showing you. You can see that there are 5 laws that we've found, but we haven't been able to find any incidents. If we scroll further down and now look at the pie graphs, you can see up the top, there's a little, just above them, there's some text that describes the overall incidence. So we've tracked 344 in our time period. 33 have been related to COVID, 92 have occurred as part of the Myanmar crisis. So if you take that to the far left pie graph, that's just broken down into a percentage, into percentages. So you can see that the Myanmar crisis is almost 30% of the entire incidence, of all the incidents we've tracked. So it has really been a significant part or a significant press freedom incident in the region over our time period. If you come to the middle of the pie graphs, you can see the types of incidents. Now, we have classified incident types in 5 ways. And again, these are defined further down on the definitions key. Firstly, police action, raids, interrogations, arrests, that sort of thing. Government and regulatory, so the introductions of laws, bans, and so on. Court and imprisonment, physical attack, and then other. In this instance, other to us could be something like, as Peter mentioned, online abuse or doxing, or other incidents that we consider to be related to press freedom. But again, it's defined below. Before I move on, I will just point out an interesting data point here. As you can see, police action is a really markedly high percentage. But when you look at the Myanmar crisis, which, as I said, has been a significant incident, you can see that almost all of the incidents have been incidents of police action. And so I actually think that the Myanmar crisis skews the overall region's data. So that police action statistic actually appears larger than, well, it is what it is, but if the Myanmar crisis hadn't occurred, I think the government and regulatory statistic would be higher or the highest in the region, which I think has interesting implications that I know Tash and Peter are interested in talking about. So as we move over to the right, you can see incident targets. Again, we've split them into 5 categories that are defined below: journalists, sources in that tiny sliver there, other media workers, so photographers and so on, media organisations, and other. Other again could be instances of citizen journalists or bloggers in circumstances where we think that they are legitimate press freedom incidents. Another example could be the recent arrest of a Mazima News driver, they're a Myanmar publisher. He was driving a bunch of journalists around while they were trying to report on one of the protests, and he was arrested as well. Now, we think this is understandably and definitely a press freedom incident. As we move further south, you can see the timeline of incidents. Now, like the map, you can interact with it via the timeline itself by zooming in or out with your tracker pad or mouse pad. But my suggestion is to interact with it via the little icons of countries down below, as that way you can zoom in onto a specific country and see the log of how those incidents have increased over time or decreased, hopefully. Now, if you click on the incident descriptions, you can see a detailed description of all of those incidents that we've tracked. Now, this is really where the data gets quite heavy. And so you can look at specific incidents and see everything there is to know about that incident, and also see a link to the source that we got that information from. You can click into specific incidents and see all of that detail there as well. That's almost all I want to show you. The last thing I'll do is show you how to interact, or sorry, how to search for one specific incident. So I'm going to choose Maria Ressa because we know, of course, that the incursions, press freedom incursions that she's faced have been significant and many over the last few years. So I've zoomed in to the Philippines, and all of the data, as you can see, has changed accordingly. Another interesting note is that physical attack in the Philippines is particularly high against journalists, and in fact we've had multiple murders of journalists in the last few years there. If we now click onto incident descriptions, you can see little search icons on all of the columns. So I will search for Maria. Oops, I have to zoom up to do that. Here we go. And I can search for Maria and zoom straight into her incident. And that shows, rather than describing or recording each of the press freedom incursions that she's faced as separate incidents, we've recorded it as one incident with multiple developments. So you can find everything you need to know about Maria Ressa or any of our other incidents through this or in this particular location when you search for them. All right, that's how you interact with the map. I think that's probably all I need to say for now. So Peter, if you would like, you can jump back on.
Thanks very much, Olivia. And now it's time to introduce a very special guest and someone who I've got tremendous respect for. She's one of life's chronic overachievers. Natasha Kassam is the director of the Lowy Institute's Public Opinion and Foreign Policy program. Before that, she was an Australian diplomat working on government policy on human rights and legal issues in China, and she drafted the government's 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper. She's also a fellow of the ANU's National Security College's Futures Council, and with a very impressive CV. I just can't think of anyone better qualified to talk about some of the issues the tracker raised. Ash, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Peter, and congratulations to you and Olivia and the team for this incredible new resource that you've put together.
Look, thanks very much. I'm just wondering if we could start. You've had a chance to look at the map yourself. I'm just wondering if what we can learn from the data as it's presented. We see obviously a fairly high number of police actions, but if we remove Myanmar from the statistics, which skews those figures, we see, I think, a heavy use of government regulation. Does that suggest governments are using what Maria Ressa refers to as lawfare, regulations, legal actions, that kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that that's not necessarily new. Governments have often interpreted laws in creative ways where it suited their purposes, and I would include our government in that. The idea behind this, I think, for a lot of governments is to have plausible deniability. So you can say that, you know, this is within the law or within the justice system. When you're criticized, you can claim that your critics don't want you to uphold the law. If you're in a country that has an opposition party, you can claim the opposition doesn't care about national security. You know, all of this is very common in the playbook. And I think what we've seen in recent years, particularly in our region, is this kind of reversion to that process. You know, you compare the backsliding in press freedom and in broader democratic freedoms in Southeast Asia, for example, to the early 90s, when we had, you know, movement after movement that was essentially trying to create a better media environment. You had the people power revolution in 1986 in the Philippines, you had democratic openings in South Korea and Taiwan, you had reformasi in Indonesia. You know, there were just all of these different processes that really led to a process of opening up. And now we really see that clamping down again, often through this kind of legislation. And it is a really concerning trend that is illustrated so clearly in this data set over just the last few years. I think the idea of national security and balancing that with press freedom, you know, that is something that no country, no government, democratic or authoritarian, has necessarily gotten right. And so it has opened the floodgates in a way, and it's just so valuable to have that tracked in the data. But what do you think, Peter? I feel like you're really well placed to also tell us how, you know, laws and national security, as you yourself personally have experienced, can be wielded by government.
Yeah, I mean, I've written about this quite extensively too, the way in which national security legislation gets repurposed or broadened, or the definitions that are used in the legislation, I think are loosely framed in ways that either explicitly or indirectly target journalists, target journalism. I know that in Egypt, when we were in prison, the Egyptian government insisted that it never imprisoned any journalists. It only had terrorists behind bars. And I think that's one of the real problems here, is trying to figure out how you classify legislation that one person or one government will insist is there purely for national security reasons, while others will see it as an attack on press freedom. I guess COVID has been a part of that process as well, where governments have used a lot of abused legislation to try and clamp down on the flow of what they term misinformation, which of course is a noble enough idea, isn't it? But it looks from our map that COVID, or at least in the way that we've framed it, COVID has clearly had an impact as well. Do you think that's a legitimate framing of what's happened?
I really do. I think that COVID-19, the pandemic, has been an opportunity for states to really reassert their control in a whole range of ways. And on the other side, publics have taken on extraordinary sacrifices to their personal freedoms and liberties in order to battle the COVID-19 pandemic. And so it really creates this environment where regulations, laws, cracking down on misinformation can lead to significant overreach. Some of it is really clear, in Malaysia and in Thailand, they passed legislation making it an offence to publish wholly or partially false information about COVID. And then you see in Indonesia that their legislation actually included, a ban on journalists publishing information that was hostile to the government. So you can really see how different governments have pushed this further. But I also think there's an interesting question of the role of government and then the role of technology companies and social media companies as a part of that issue around misinformation and limiting press freedom. This goes back a long way. It was in 2005, for example, that Yahoo informed Chinese authorities that a dissident Xu Tao had published, or I think sent on, a memo about the Tiananmen massacre, and he was imprisoned as a result of that. And then more recently, we've seen Twitter, for example, censoring posts in India that were criticizing the government, or censoring journalists posting online, criticizing the government's response to the tragedy that unfolded there earlier this year. So there's, the role of government, but then that's also tied up with social media companies and tech companies as well, I think.
We've been very deliberate in the map in not creating a ranking. Rankings is something that a lot of other press freedom organisations seem to do. I'm just wondering, as a former diplomat and foreign policy analyst, do you see that as a helpful thing or frustrating?
I think it's mainly helpful, but I do understand why people often use indexes and rankings. They tell simple stories. They give you a headline. It's a really easy way to communicate information when you say this person's at the top, this person's at the bottom, here we are in between. And I see that as a powerful tool. But as we often find with indexes, there are so many different factors that simple list is, it masks, I think, the complexity of what's actually going on in those countries. So if you think about, imagine you're a diplomat overseas, say you're in Beijing like I was, and you need to go into the foreign ministry and make clear your concerns about Yang Hengjun and Cheng Lei, two Australian writers that have been imprisoned in China. So your job is to go in and make these representations. What you really want to do is have them hear you. And if you walk in and say the Australian government abhors your treatment of these two writers, that that's never going to be received in a particularly constructive way. When you can point to something like the Press Freedom Tracker, you can point to an independent resource and say, this is the way in which this country is being listed, and these are the ways in which you've improved, and these are the ways in which things have gone backwards. I do think it gives you an additional tool to work with in terms of your advocacy, and one that isn't taken as kind of personally as from that country. You also have the other countries which provide interesting benchmarks, but again, without the ranking, without saying you're the worst in the world or the worst in the region or you're in the middle, or one of those things. I do think it makes people more willing to hear from you. And the idea around these kinds of conversations about human rights, about press freedoms, about individual liberties is to be coming from a position of understanding and trying to be constructive rather than superiority or judgment. But again, you are really well placed to know how kind of advocacy and foreign policy works in the case of political prisoners or trying to improve human rights in a country. How do you see the ranking system or lack of ranking?
Look, I'm inclined to agree. I mean, we thought very hard about it and decided that the ranking system probably wouldn't be particularly helpful, but we did need the data in there. And I think a lot of governments, my experience has been that a lot of governments often curse and swear and insist that this is, sort of these are Western liberal ideas that are being imposed on some of these governments. But at the same time, it does matter. They do take notice, even if they don't acknowledge it. These kinds of numbers and the kinds of presentations of their countries in public fora like these actually does make a difference. And I think it is helpful to be able to go into meetings and conversations, whether it's with government officials or diplomats, or just to bring up the numbers in public forums. It's useful to have them, as you say, collated in a way that is as neutral as we can possibly make it. But of course, this is always going to be seen as something we've done. Well, let me say this: we've done our best to make it value neutral, to not impose judgments on it. But of course, it's starting with the idea that that press freedom is a positive thing. I know that we're sometimes criticised for promoting Western liberal ideas that don't sit with some Asian cultures. Do you think that is a fair criticism?
I don't, and I'll be frank. I hear that criticism a lot. I think that it's disingenuous and self-serving generally, where particular governments are looking to encourage more favourable coverage or to limit external criticism. Activists and individuals and journalists demanding accountability and respect for these rights come from all cultural and linguistic backgrounds. There's fierce, independent, groundbreaking journalism throughout the history of most countries. To my mind, there's nothing particularly European or Western about those elements. And if you look even just right this moment in our region, look at the farmers in India, the protesters in Hong Kong, the people of Myanmar. Across the region, there are these long and proud traditions of people demanding better government and holding their government to account through fearless and frank reporting. So I think to claim otherwise really is self-serving. I completely understand that different cultures are going to do things in different ways, but that, for me, that kind of baseline of independent journalism, of accountability and good governance, I think that that is fairly universal, or at least it should be.
Yeah, and as far as we're concerned, the kind of accountability role that journalists play, the role that they play in keeping the system transparent and keeping a flow of information isn't Western. It isn't unique to any particular culture. It's valuable wherever you are and whatever your cultural values are. Of course, Australia doesn't come out squeaky clean in the tracker. We've got those two notorious raids by the Australian Federal Police a few years ago that really highlighted some of the issues here. And we've seen a whole raft of pieces of our own national security legislation that have chipped away at the ability of journalists to do their work. Are we just as bad as some of the more authoritarian states in the region?
You're absolutely right. Those incidents in the tracker show that Australia can and has to do better on a whole range of fronts. There are two things I would say about this. The first is that Australia is not very good at owning our own deficiencies, and I think that that's to our detriment. I think it would be a powerful, powerful thing if, for example, when Chinese state media criticizes Australia's history of dispossession and trauma or our alleged war crimes in Afghanistan, it would be so powerful if, rather than becoming outraged at that criticism, we said, yes, this is a problem and we've made mistakes and we are learning. It was in Alaska, Jake Sullivan, the US National Security Advisor, he said to his Chinese counterparts that a confident country is able to look at its own shortcomings and constantly seek to improve. That is the secret sauce of America. I really think Australia can and should do better on this front, not just to improve ourselves, but because it would lead to more compelling representations in foreign policy and advocacy overseas. But the second thing I want to say to that point that Australia is just as bad as authoritarian countries, or people who like to say that, often to kind of divert attention, I think, from some of these issues overseas and to look more closely at what we need to do better. Yeah. So this is often described as whataboutism, right? Australia can't criticize X country until we do better on asylum seekers, on press freedom, on a whole range of issues that absolutely need to be improved. But I think we need to be careful about drawing equivalences between this behaviour. What is the difference between the Australian government intimidating a journalist and an authoritarian government intimidating a journalist? Both are bad. They're very bad. I'm not suggesting they're not, but I would argue the difference is transparency. In Australia, this behaviour is exposed by a free press. It is recorded and shared on a relatively free internet. And ultimately, if it is deemed significantly unacceptable, Australians can have their day at the ballot box and they can say, we do not want this government anymore. By contrast, authoritarian governments, they see the free flow of information as a threat to their legitimacy, and they often draw upon the extraordinary apparatus of control and censorship and repression to keep it that way. So, I do think Australia needs to do better. There are so many cases, Witness K comes to mind as a critical example of Australian malfeasance, and our public deserves better than that. But I still don't think that it can be compared to the ways in which authoritarian systems really limit press freedoms in their countries. And, I think we need to be really careful when we draw those equivalences.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think the fact that there was such a vigorous public debate and a couple of parliamentary inquiries, including some fairly sweeping recommendations for reform in the wake of the AFP raids, is a mark of how things are different. I mean, clearly you couldn't carry on those kinds of conversations in a lot of other states. But as you say, at the same time, I don't think that gives us a leave pass to say that we shouldn't be working on these issues and we shouldn't be pushing through with those reforms. Tasha, I think it's time to take some questions from our audience. And the first question is from Austin, who's asking, does it make sense to focus sometimes on the nature of the government rather than on the law in question? That's an interesting question. Olivia, Tash, do you have a view on that?
Well, I mean, I think we probably need to look at both, because there are certainly countries that have, authoritarian governments, but relatively well-functioning courts. Nobody would suggest it was perfect, but there are ways in which these things come together. And particularly where you have an alignment of priorities but at the kind of government level and between having more transparency. So one example I would give is that there was, when I was living in China, there was an issue there in terms of the court systems having incredible amounts of inertia, because there was this wide-ranging anti-corruption drive. Everybody was terrified of being done for corruption, and so they were just doing nothing. And so one of the ways in which the kind of central government had to try to get things moving again was to essentially put a little bit more freedom into the court system. Now, it is not comparable to a lot of other countries, but that is an example of where some laws were actually good laws that were being passed at that moment, and some of those laws were actually being upheld. Some rights around privacy and other things were actually improving, even within an authoritarian system. Focusing on a type of government as an advocate or even as a diplomat, I mean, it gives you less tools to work with, because it means you're kind of regime change or bust. Whereas if you can say, hey, here's a law to protect people with disabilities, or an anti-discrimination law, the system of government is not necessarily going to affect how on board people are going to be with those kinds of ideas.
And I think in terms of a tracker as well, what we're looking for is a way of monitoring particular incidents that add up to an overall narrative. We don't necessarily want to, at least in the tracker, join the dots. That should be the work of other advocates. But at least if you have a list of independent events, things that have happened that you can track and put dates on and details for, it's quite difficult to deny that kind of thing, and it's easier to have a conversation around those very specific incidents. It's much harder to tackle a country when we brand them as positive or negative for press freedom in the whole. You then end up with in a rather difficult conversation around value judgments on a particular country, and I don't necessarily think that's always helpful. We've got a comment from Prue who's saying that it's telling that we've just got to spend so much time answering questions about our press freedom compared with authoritarian regimes rather than other Western democracies. Do you think that's a fair comment, Dash?
I think that we do have to spend a lot of time on those issues. I think probably a lot of Western democracies also spend a lot of time answering to these, but I suppose it's telling about the nature of our governments and some of the challenges that they're facing. Because I mean, there is this issue, I think, now where you've got, just as an example, right, when the internet first came, everybody was very excited, and this was going to be this great freeing, I think it was Bill Clinton who said you can't nail jello to a wall. The idea was that this would bring democracy and freedom to everybody and free speech would be wonderful. We can now see in 2021 that unfettered freedom of speech leads to riots at the Capitol. It leads to horrific atrocities in Myanmar. These things cannot be entirely unchecked, right? And so getting this balance right for both authoritarian and democratic governments, I think, is just an incredibly challenging thing. And there's always going to be an incentive or an imperative to control. And I think essentially we're doing better in democratic countries at pushing back on that, and we're talking a lot about it, but I still think those basic building blocks are there.
I think what Prue is also suggesting is that on the scale of comparisons, we're fighting to be compared with, we're finding ourselves compared with authoritarian regimes rather than the people,
Yes.
countries who we might think of as our Western democratic peers. On paper, the fact is that we have no constitutional protection for press freedom, no explicit legal protections for press freedom or freedom of speech anywhere in our legislation. It's all implied and inferred, and it's all very, very mushy, and it puts us way, way behind our Western democratic compatriots, and we are finding ourselves being compared to more authoritarian regimes, and even then we don't always come out looking particularly flash.
Yeah, I think our defamation laws are considered worse than most places, and the chilling effect that has on journalists. And of course, we've seen incredible independent journalism in the face of those threats, but of course it has a really problematic effect. And Australia needs to think very seriously about why we're being compared in the way we are.
Yeah, and I think one other thing that's worth pointing out too is that the AJF has a regional dialogue project, which we hope will, we know all of this data will feed into, and the whole point of that regional dialogue is to open up conversations around the value of press freedom, the role that the press plays, to try and unpack that trade-off that a lot of people see as between national security and press freedom, which I disagree is actually a trade-off. It implies if you have more of one, by definition, you have less of the other, and I don't think that's a fair, accurate way of portraying things. We've got another question from, I think it's Niraj, who asks, these days media work crosses borders easily because of technology. So is this a way out to fight curbs on media freedom? Is it successful? I might just sort of tackle that, Niraj, and say that actually it helps being able to cross borders, and certainly there are a lot of journalists who are working in exile in their home countries. But it really isn't the same. There's a reason that we have foreign correspondents that are based in foreign countries, and increasingly international news organisations, or news organisations generally, are relying on local correspondents to be their eyes and ears. We've seen this with the departure of the last journalist who worked for Australian news organisations earlier this year. I think it was earlier this year, when from China. We don't have our own eyes and ears in the country any longer. We're relying on others, and we're reporting trying to report back into that country. And I think that makes it very, very difficult for us to really have the kind of depth of understanding that we need to have. Tash, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, only to say that I agree that it is really challenging to not be able to be there in person. Technology doesn't make up for it. But one trend that I think is really interesting in our region is the growth of civil society movements across borders via technology, and that includes a range of citizen journalist groups, particularly in Southeast Asia through the Milk Tea Alliance. I think it's really exciting to see at a time where many borders are closed and when people aren't able to interact as they used to because of the pandemic, the creativity that has come through for civil society and for advocacy groups to connect and to work together. And, a lot of this conversation is quite depressing, but that's something that gives me optimism.
I absolutely agree that technology has allowed us, and I've just been having some really interesting conversations about the way that technology has opened up parts of Africa that were completely blind to us. Because the technology has created infrastructure and allowed communication into places where they just didn't exist before. But as someone who spent 25 years as a foreign correspondent, I know that there is just no way that you can report without being on the ground. It just doesn't. There is no substitute for being there, and it always makes it hard to report with authority and credibility if you're not there, if you're not able to give eyewitness accounts or speak to people firsthand. All right, I think we might actually be coming to a close. Olivia, are there any more questions? If there aren't, then well, I've got one final question. Nope, sorry, forgive me. Or how do we foresee collaboration and cooperation with other existing press freedom organisations? Again, I think that might be something that I can take on. We've always worked very closely with other press freedom organisations. The CPJ in particular was in fact, in a lot of respects, was the inspiration for the AJF. That's the Committee for the Protection of Journalists. It's based in New York. And we also work closely with organisations like RSF and others. We see that, a lot of those organisations are doing their own monitoring as well, but no one that we're aware of monitors exclusively for the Asia Pacific region, and that's something that we're very keen to push and to advocate for. We think that there is, most of the press freedom organisations around the world are really focused on North America and Europe in particular, and because of the relationship that those regions have to the Middle East and North Africa, those areas get a lot of coverage. But I think the Asia Pacific region is underserved and really needs an organisation to help rally and focus attention on the region. That's really what we're trying to do. All right, I think, Tash, do you have any other thoughts, any concluding ideas or comments or observations before I hand back to Olivia?
Well, maybe just to build off that point, that I think we're very lucky to have, a range of organizations working in this space. And certainly from my perspective, now in a think tank and previously in government, being able to draw on kind of a variety of sources for these sorts of issues and then bringing them together to brainstorm how things can be done differently or better is incredibly valuable. And one of the questions that's come up quite a bit is the kind of trade-offs between, ranking countries and saying you're terrible or another isn't, and trying to work with them collaboratively, often behind closed doors. You'll see the Australian government has kind of moved in different directions on that. Sometimes they opt for the public statement to criticise press freedom or another issue of human rights in another country, and sometimes they'll say nothing and opt to try to be able to have that conversation behind closed doors. These things happen on a case-by-case basis. I'm not suggesting that it always is gotten exactly right, but I do think that having this kind of data set with such kind of granular data that you can see unfolding almost in real time, right? Looking at the Hong Kong data, it feels like, you're tracking it as it happens. I think it's an incredible resource, and I just wanted to congratulate you and the team again.
Look, thanks very much, Tash. And before I hand back to Olivia to wrap things up, I also think it's worth acknowledging that it was the Lowy Institute's incredible Asia Power Index that really served as an inspiration for our own press freedom tracker. So that's about it from me. Over to you, Olivia.
Here I am again. Thank you both so much, Tash. It's been so fantastic to have you speak, especially with your diplomatic and foreign policy perspective. So we are very grateful to have your mind on this. And Peter, thank you as well. Now, also thank you to all of our attendees. It was fantastic to have people joining from all over the region, as I said to begin with. And we're really we're looking forward to expanding this, this tracker. As we mentioned, we have only just started, and we thought the approach of getting the useful information out there sooner rather than later was better than waiting until we have everything or every location possible tracked. So we really hope you find it useful, and always welcome feedback. So my contact details are on the AJF website, very easy to find, and I look forward to hearing from you all, and thank you again.